Good morning. Hello, YouTube. Today I'm going to discuss fa- famous rock bands that had gone a long period without touring and had not played and had barely played live for for several years. I mean, while these bands, while many of these bands while some of these bands are performing are performing live very frequently today, there was a time during their careers that they have gone a long period, presumably decades, without playing a single show. Let's get the list started. Okay, first off, I would like to kick off this list with the band with the the Rolling Stones. Okay, for the Rolling Stones wrapped up the Tattoo You touring cycle in the summer of 1982, 20 years after their career began. And the roll, I mean, for most of the 1980s, Mick Jagger and Keith, the tensions and animosity between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had gone out of hand, and during the and due to musical differences and various other reasons. Mick Jagger had began a successful career as a solo artist, and Keith Richards later followed in his footsteps. For Hips. Hips. The as a result of the ongoing tensions between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, the band had not toured in support of 1983's Undercover nor 1986's Dirty Work, and were barely speaking to each other for most of the decade. Come 1989, however, the Rolling Stones made a successful comeback with the release of Steel Wheels, and the band embarked on their first tour in 7 years. Guns N' Roses. Guns N' Roses wrapped up their controversial yet successful Use Your Illusion tour in 1993. Shortly after that, the band released a punk rock covers album, The Spaghetti Incident. After that, tensions between lead vocalist Axl Rose and the remaining members of the band had really taken a toll on the band, and lead guitarist Slash left, drummer Matt Storm was fired from the band, and bassist Duff McKagan left. While Guns N' Roses never officially disbanded, Axl Rose continued the band with different musicians, and in the late 90s, the band began recording a new studio album that took over a decade to complete. Yes. Guns N' Roses embarked on their first tour in nearly a decade in 2001. Although half the shows were canceled, but the band but the band toured again in 2006 with another new lineup featuring Bumblefoot on guitar, and after years of delays, Chinese Democracy was finally released in late 2008. And after years of frequent touring, Slash and Duff McKagan both returned to the band in early 2016 for an extensive stadium tour. Queen. As early as 1982, Queen's popularity as a band declined after the release of Hot Space. Fans hated the album due to its more dance and disco sound, and after Queen's popularity in the U.S. went downhill, and the band would not tour again post 1982. While Queen still made high-profile live appearances at Live Aid and the like, Queen would not, Queen's in 1986, Queen embarked on their final ever tour with their original lineup due to Freddie Mercury's health issues. Freddie Mercury died of AIDS in November 1991. While Queen never officially disbanded, the band had very rarely performed as an active band, and only performed for special occasions as Queen plus guest vocalist's name. In late 2004, Queen recruited Paul Rogers of Bad Company as and reunited as Queen plus Paul Rogers for an extensive world tour. The collaboration with Paul Rogers continued until early 2009. Then in late 2011, Adam Lambert took hold, and Queen united as Queen plus Adam Lambert, and the band still continues to tour with Adam Lambert to this day. The Beatles. In 1966, the Beatles embarked on their final ever tour. Due to the change in their musical style, as their songs were becoming increasingly difficult to perform live and required too many instruments. 2 years later, tensions between all four Beatles, mainly between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, had gone out of hand. The band, while the Beatles had planned to tour together again and were thinking about it, the band it was unable. It became impossible to happen, as they all couldn't agree on whether to do it again, with Billy Preston as a fifth Beatle, as a fifth member, supporting the band on keyboards. The Beatles ultimately disbanded in early 1970. Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd wrapped up the Wall tour in 1981. During this time, tensions between Roger Waters and David Gilmour had gone increasingly out of control. After the release of the final cut in early 1983, which was technically a Roger Waters solo album, a lawsuit between Roger Waters and David Gilmour ensued, and was not settled until 1985, when Roger Waters agreed to leave the band, and David Gilmour was given the right to continue the band. With only 2 members left continuing Pink Floyd, the band, David Gilmour rehired former keyboardist Richard Wright and let him and he was allowed to contribute to their as a contributor rather than a full-time band member. 1987, Pink Floyd embarked on their first tour in years, their first tour without Roger Waters, and the band released A Momentary Lapse of Reason. R.E.M. R.E.M. wrapped up their tour in support of 1988's Green in late 1989, a year after its release. During the early 1990s, R.E.M. very rarely played live, only playing like one show a year for the next 5 years. 1991's Out of Time and 1992's Automatic for the People were technically 2 of the band's most successful releases, and also two of their most softest albums, both featuring acoustic guitars and string arrangements, the latter especially. After years of excessive non-stop touring, the band needed a break and decided not to tour in support of Out of Time. And as Automatic for the People was a further continuation of the soft sounds of Out of Time, the band ultimately would not tour in support of that album either. R.E.M's next album was 1994's Monster, and in 1995, R.E.M. embarked on their first major tour in several years, which was plagued by multiple health issues suffered by several of the band members, most notably drummer Bill Berry's aneurysm. Alice in Chains. During the peak of their career in the early 90s, Alice in Chains were plagued by the multiple drug problems of lead vocalist Lane Staley, who preventing the band from touring. Lane Staley's drug addiction had taken a toll on the band, and after wrapping up their tour in support of 1992's Dirt in late 1993, and the band canceled planned tours for the remainder of the decade. Bizkit. Pearl Jam. Well, unlike most other bands mentioned, Pearl Jam has technically continued to tour, but 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 in the U.S. during their 1990s heyday, Pearl Jam did not embark on any full-scale tours in the U.S. in support of 1994's Vitology nor 1996's No Code due to their boycott, their lawsuit with concert ticket company Ticketmaster. The lead vocalist Eddie Vedder was having a hard time dealing with success and dealing with fame. And the band ultimately began a boycott Ticketmaster, and from which lasted from 1994 to 1998. And the band only played fewer U.S. shows rather than full-scale tours throughout 1995 and 1996 in support of Vitology and No Code, respectively. Pearl Jam embarked on their first major U.S. tour in 1998 in support of Yield. That was their first major U.S. tour in 4 years since 1994. Last but not least, Limp Bizkit. Love him or hate him, Limp Bizkit still counts. Okay. Wes Borland left the band in 2001. And then the band hired Mike Smith as their new guitarist. The band's released the criminally underrated Results May Vary, which had a more melodic sound, and compared to other previous albums. And the bands played their last show for several years in early 2004. Mike Smith ultimately left the band, and Wes Borland briefly returned. But the bands would not play live for several years, as Wes Borland left the band a second time, and the band was on hiatus for years to come. Wes Borland would ultimately return to the band in early 2009, stayed with the band since, and the band embarked on their first tour in several years. In 2013, Limp Bizkit toured the U.S. for the first time in a decade. Anyway, if you know any other bands that have gone through these long periods without touring or without playing live, just comment, let me know. Comment, rate, subscribe. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you like my video. Bye.